Okay, we skip a few pages. This guy, Edward Luttwak, a prominent critic of the Army, later wrote. He sums it up pretty well here. Quote, "American forces in the Vietnam War were marvels of efficiency. Their communications were efficient. Their logistics were efficient. Their transportation, even their administration of firepower. Yes, our managers in uniform were very efficient. The only trouble is that they were not very combat effective." There you go. Efficient, comfortable, safe, but we lost. Now, about the one-year tour of duty, just a little bit here. As the U.S. role gradually increased in 1965, and American soldiers began pouring into Vietnam by the tens of thousands, MACV Commander General Westmoreland recommended that the new troops serve the same one-year tour of duty that had been set for the Americans, who served as advisors before. So there's the precedent for it, was that advisors who had been sent over went for a year. He did so because he foresaw a protracted war of attrition in which the will of America would be sorely tried, and in which a tour of any longer than 1 year would be, he wrote, quote, "likely to bring a hue and cry to bring home the boys." Politically, Westmoreland's judgment was astute, although he failed to anticipate that the inequitable draft law would result in manpower shortages. So he thought they'd be able to get enough people, even though they were holding the tour down to a year. Militarily, however, his decision was open to question, for it resulted in the DEROS system, DEROS, date eligible for return from overseas, which caused most soldiers to think more about crossing off 365 days on their calendar than about accomplishing a common military mission. Very good point I think we've gone over. After 6 months in action, a soldier began to come down with the short-timers fever and to think about surviving to the end of his year. "We had a saying in Vietnam," recalled medic Scott Gauthier, "as soon as you set foot on Vietnamese soil, you're dead. Mark yourself as dead. And from that point on, all you're doing is fighting for the right to go home again, to live again. That was the incentive we had." End quote. As another soldier put it, quote, "I'm fighting for number one, me." See, you stick them in a bad situation, tie their hands behind their backs, and tell them to go out and do ineffective things that don't lead to any ultimate goal, and how are the soldiers going to react? They're going to become very morose. We skip a few pages. Now, the rotation in command was so constant that in this one case there's this area called the Iron Triangle, and there was a set of tunnels 4 kilometers long altogether. Now, they had been explored and mapped. They were actually mapped, and one of the commanders who had gotten done with his tour of duty and went home had maps of this sitting on his desk in Detroit, and he sent them to his own units back in the Iron Triangle after a while, and the units found that the tunnels were still there, and the Viet Cong were still using them. Okay, so military knowledge of the tunnels sort of passed out of existence when this commander went to the States, and when he heard through whatever means that they were treating the Iron Triangle as if it had not been explored and was not known, he sent them the maps of the tunnels. Now, that's when you start the war by saying, we don't want anybody to get bug-out fever and want to go home, we want to keep everybody friendly, we don't want to upset the populace, we want to be nice to everybody, we don't want to upset anybody, so we're going to have a one-year tour of duty. When you start out with that, it gets you in deeper and deeper trouble as you go. This guy named John Paul Vann, a retired Army officer, he says, this was an often quoted quip, "The United States has not been in Vietnam for 10 years, but 1 year, 10 times. And there we go. We did not have 10 years of experience in Vietnam. We had 1 year of experience in Vietnam. And the people who were there 3 or 4 years ago had nothing to do with what was going on today, at any given day. Skip a few pages. Now, when we made the decision to draw down our forces and to ultimately withdraw from the country and hand everything over to the South Vietnamese army, the South Vietnamese government didn't like this. They were not in favor of it. And so, instead of facing reality and saying, okay, if we don't want to be living in a communist state, we're going to have to either die in combat or kill the enemy. We're going to have to do something. Instead of facing reality and taking that attitude, they just didn't really do anything. Quote, "Old programs were kept unchanged, except for a new sense of urgency and emphasis instilled by the U.S. decision to phase down and eventually withdraw its forces." So, from the programs that were in place that we were trying to train an army and so on, those programs remained unchanged even after we said we're leaving. There was slightly more urgency to it, but the South Vietnamese didn't have any leadership that stepped up to say, here's what needs to happen, here's what we need to do. It didn't have any charismatic or intelligent or thoughtful people who were going to give a grand strategy to it. No, rather, what it had was some troops selling ammunition and guns to the North Vietnamese. Some of the South Vietnamese troops were Viet Cong, undercover. Alright, skip a little bit. Contrary to mythology, the military rarely oppose their commander-in-chief, even privately, observes Henry Kissinger. If they can conjure up a halfway plausible justification, they will overcome their misgivings and support a presidential decision. Now, that statement there seems to me flies in the face of all of the evidence in Vietnam. The commander-in-chief says that he wants to do this, that, and the other, but the people on the ground in Vietnam just did not seem like they wanted to do that. And they weren't allowed to. They couldn't. They were not allowed to be effective. I think that Kissinger said that in the midst of Vietnam, looking back in history at the other wars and stuff, and probably you get this sort of attitude from the soldiers. I've heard this about the war in Afghanistan and Iraq today. The soldiers say, look, I'm not here to decide whether or not we should stay for 5 years. I'm just here to do the job that I've been told to do. The president sent us here to give these people freedom, and that's my job. That's what I'm here to do. Not to question whether or not we should be here, but to do the job I've been sent for. So I've heard that attitude. But it seems like it fell apart, didn't it, in Vietnam? It seems like the people had their statements from their commanders-in-chief, and the statements from the commanders-in-chief made these people less interested in carrying out their orders, less interested in trying, because they knew it was a farce. They knew it was a farce from top to bottom. So, poor old Kissinger. We skip down a little ways now. There's this program of Vietnamizing all of the American functions, so that as America leaves, the Vietnamese take up the functions needed for the army to continue. Some of the functions were able to melt away when the army left, but some of the functions our army was fulfilling, and they had to take that up. Quote, "Privately they called the program alleged or pretended Vietnamization, simply a cover for the U.S. withdrawal. The South Vietnamese, they said, could never hack it alone." That was the attitude of some of the American military, was that it's just pretended Vietnamization, and we're leaving, and the South Vietnamese are not going to be able to hack it. Now this Commander Vice Admiral Robert Salzer says, "I think the idea was that we would do what we could in the time allotted to us, and somehow things would work out." Now, somehow things did sort of work out, because the Americans came home, a lot, except for 37,000 of them or something like that, and the expenditures on war stopped, came to an end, but a whole country was lost to communism, and sat there and suffered under communism and stagnated for the next 30 years. So, and they've only just in the last 10 years or so 15 years they've started coming out of their shell and trading and commercializing